the voice of God's presence. And so we talked a little bit about how that expresses itself in pre-Jewish, pre-Christian pagan religion, the building of altars and temples in groves, caves, and mountaintops. But then in the Bible, the major theme is, of course, the building of the temple. And we kind of go back to the book of Exodus when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt to come to Mount Sinai. They build the tabernacle, and I always tell the story. That's when my first attempt at reading the Bible cover to cover hit a wall, because the stories are fun to read. In Genesis, lots of stories. First half of Exodus, lots of stories. And then you get chapter after chapter after chapter of this is how you build the menorah. These are the ingredients for the oil. They hung the curtains. And I remember reading that back in high school and thinking, man, this is really dull. Why is all of this here? And it was tough. But then at a certain point down the road, I began to get the idea that maybe the temple, the tabernacle, was a lot more important in the Bible than I realized. It was clearly important to the writer. He slows down and he hammers away at that. Genesis 1, the creation account, appears to be depicting creation as the building of a temple. So that's huge. And then you get to Exodus, and of course Jesus depicts himself as the temple in the New Testament. And that became a major focus of my thinking from that point forward. So we talked a little bit last week about the vacated temple, the broken mirror, the covenant, the sanctuary. The Garden of Eden is the first depiction of the temple in the Bible. You have the tree and the food and the cherubim and the fire and the water, even the way the garden is set up. So sometimes I call it theological geography. It's geography, but it's theological geography. When people are sent east, they're sent away from the holy place. Today's lesson is on the voice of reason. There's a stack of them over there. So it's kind of an introduction to the class. And we've talked about the voice of God's presence. And today we're going to talk about the voice of reason. I put a quote up here from Romans chapter 1. This is Paul's famous quote, which kind of finds its way into systematic theologies whenever they deal with what's called general revelation. What can we know about God generally just by observing creation? Second paragraph here. God speaks through reason. In this quote from Romans 1:20, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Paul here is attacking the ancient person's worship of creation. And he is saying, seems to want to be saying, that mankind has always known that behind the things that we can see and taste and touch, there is a spiritual world. And man knows this. Somewhere deep down he knows it, but of course he denies it. And reason is one of the ways that we get in touch with the things that we cannot see or touch, because it's abstract thinking. So, for centuries and centuries and centuries, we thought that the sun moved and that we were still. because that's how it looks. If you walk outside the door right now, you see, oh yeah, there's the sun. It's moving. And we're the one who is sitting still. That's all what philosophers call the realm of appearance. That's how it looks, yes. But it took a long time to reason our way into the point of thinking that maybe that's not the case. If I'm standing by a pool of water and I put a stick into it, the stick looks bent. Put it in a pool of water, it looks like the stick is bent. Now, I know it's not bent somewhere in my head, but that's how it looks. And so reason is one of the ways mankind has pressed into the idea that the world is not always as it seems. We have our five senses, and there's a way that things look that are directly in front of us. But as we mature, we realize, well, things are not always as they seem. And now in modern 20th and 21st century physics, there is a whole world of particles, atomic particles, subatomic particles, and even things below the level of that, swirling around in the world around us that we never knew anything about, and our reason has enabled us to get in touch with those. So in the second paragraph here, I say God speaks through reason. It is part of his eternal word, the resonance of his voice in the mind of man. This stands in opposition to the popular view that there's some kind of conflict between rationality and religion. Even from a Christian point of view, this belief would be suspect since man's rational faculties are clearly part of the good work of the Creator. We can argue that our faculties have been corrupted by sin, but this calls for redemption rather than rejection. It could not provide grounds for sidestepping reason in making our appeal to religious authority. For we are not confronted with one, but several competing voices of religious authority, and we must have a reason to listen to one and reject the others. At some level, all men fit their beliefs to the evidence. The conscientious subject them to rational criticism. The learned integrate them into whatever else they may have learned in philosophy, humanities, and the sciences. What is all that saying? It's that the life of the mind and thinking and reasoning is part of our spiritual journey. I said this a little bit in a sermon last Sunday, but it's not as though there's reason on the one hand and religion on the other. I've always believed that those two things come together. And so if something is true, all truth is God's truth, and it should follow as a matter of course. Faith goes beyond reason. Faith is a form of trust. And that's true even in ordinary human relationships. When we trust a person, that is an act of the will. Now, there can be reasons for trusting a person, and there can be reasons for distrusting a person. And you probably experienced this in your own life. How many have had a relationship with a person who they have trusted for a long, long time against evidences to the contrary that that person could not be trusted? You've done it time and time again. So trust can go against reason. But then there might be good reasons to trust a person and you get bungled all the same. So reason and trust have an interesting relationship with one another. At the bottom of page 14, I talk a little bit about what I call here a brief history of reason. And by reason here, I mean stepping back from what we see and hear and touch and thinking through things. We're eventually going to come to ancient Greece. Greece in the 6th century BC is in many ways one of the most important events in world history. The cultivation of reason that happened in that civilization has become the fountainhead of a tremendous amount of what is now taken for granted in Western civilization. History, science, medicine, mathematics, name it. The Greeks developed a civilization that was so wealthy and so strong, and all of their earthly needs were taken care of, at least this is what Aristotle says, that they had all this extra time to think and wonder about things, and they could discover. And that is true. If you think about it, we don't really... most people in most places in the world spend all of their time trying to survive. We need food, we need shelter, we need protection, we need weapons. We're trying to survive. Only when a civilization reaches such a point of flourishing that you have a significant number of people who have all kinds of extra time on their hands can they devote themselves to education. Because education is not the most practical thing. I mean, if I got students coming to me at school learning Latin, this is not going to get them a six-figure salary. Right, you know. So all of our earliest ancestors were religious. Bottom of page 14. And then over on page 15, we learn a little bit about these cultures. The earliest great civilizations on page 15 are Babylon and Egypt. But they are all very, very practical. Mankind develops most of his intellectual energy to developing technologies of practical interest. Astronomy, architecture, medicine, the arts of war. Babylon and Egypt are the earliest civilizations where these are developed to a very, very high degree. You would not find people in Babylon and Egypt who pursue truth for the love of truth. They pursue truths for some practical benefit that they can get out of it. Like when I was young and I just graduated from high school, and I was at my high school graduation party. So people asked me, "What are you going to do?" And I'm going to university. What are you going to study? I'm studying philosophy and literature. And I remember the faces of some of the people when I said that would kind of darken. And they would say, "Oh." And then they asked the eternal question, "What are you going to do with that?" But I think the idea was, that's cool and everything, but how are you going to earn money doing that, right? What is the practical benefit? How does that bring food? Put food on the table, clothes on the back, roof over the house. So we as human beings are incurable pragmatists. And I'm not saying those people were wrong. I'm just saying that that was the question. And I felt the pinch of it then. I feel the pinch of it now. When you pursue those kinds of things, you've got to ask yourself, well, how are you going to monetize that? So, all of the old nature religions, when they worship Baal and Zeus and all of the different deities, get a front row seat. There wasn't anything that we would call rational criticism. The first break, page 15, third paragraph, the first break with this pattern began among the Jews in their encounter with Yahweh, and then among the Gentiles with the emergence of philosophy in 6th century Greece. So pagan religion, if you go back and read some of the beliefs and the practices, is highly irrational. Sometimes the kids ask at school, the Greeks believed that the gods gathered on the top of Mount Olympus. And I say, yes. And then they say, why didn't anybody go up to the mountain and just look? and I don't have a good answer for that. What's that?
Verify.
Yeah, verify. That sort of comes to us. You like verify something. But when you read ancient literature, there is a unsettling lack of interest in verifying things. It's second nature to us in the West. If somebody makes a truth claim, you go and find out whether it's true. Now, they did have methods for testing truth claims, but they weren't the sorts of things that today we would put too much trust in. So, in the Old Testament, Yahweh claims to be a very different God than the gods of the nations. Gods of the nations, they worship the sky, they worship the sun, they worship the sea, they worship the arts of war or love or other this worldly things. But Yahweh is really, really tricky. He's behind all of that. I am that I am. I'm just being as such. I created all of the things that you can see. And the Israelites really struggle with that. Because the first thing they want to do when they worship a deity is to create a statue of it and put it in their temple. And the second commandment tells them they're not allowed to do that. So they have an invisible deity that they can't even picture in their heads. And the second blow comes from ancient Greece. On page 15, the earliest philosophers were followers of Thales, who wanted to discover the one material substance underlying natural objects. They were followed by Pythagoras, who was more interested in exhibiting how natural objects could be understood with reference to mathematical laws. These early Greek philosophers are the first to begin breaking away from pagan religion. Now, Thales is the first to suppose there must be a reason for matter. We could take this table, this chair, or the things we see around us. They break down, they're built back up. Somewhere back of that, there must be some fundamental thing of which all material things are made. And we've been on that journey ever since. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, there are 4 elements: air, earth, fire, water. Now, if you walk into your science class today, there are a lot more than 4 elements. Okay, you look on that, wow, that's a lot of elements. There's like potassium and hydrogen and all of these different kinds of things. Now, if you go below the elemental level, then you have atoms. When you have molecules, and then you have atoms. And for a while, we thought, well, atoms, that's fundamental. But I suppose most of you here learned that there are also subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. And for a while, we thought, well, that's it. There's those 3. Anybody ever study particle physics? Yeah, a little bit. When you go below protons, neutrons, and electrons, you're talking teach? Quarks, leptons, hadrons, and they got it all laid out. The world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. I guess what I'm saying is, in ancient Greece, Thales is the first philosopher to send us down that path. Another important philosopher is Pythagoras. Pythagoras, most of you just know him because you had to remember a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and you know your Pythagorean theorem. was one of the first to begin discovering mathematical patterns in the world, in chords, in things in nature. And so he wasn't interested in finding what the fundamental matter was, but he was interested in discovering mathematical laws that lay behind things. A few other famous names here from ancient Greece. Democritus founded the atomic theory. He wasn't able to prove it at the time, but that certainly comes out of ancient Greece. Empedocles proposed our four-element hypothesis: air, earth, fire, and water. And also the idea that the behavior of these elementary particles was guided by positive and negative charges. He called them love and hate because they didn't have any language for science at the time. Laws of attraction and repulsion, though. Anaxagoras brought philosophy to the city of Athens and argued that the universe could only be explained with a reference to a single overarching mind. He was followed by Socrates, who argued that this mind spoke to man about right and wrong behavior through the medium of his conscience. Both of these thinkers had an important impact on Plato and Aristotle, who in turn had a very big impact on Judaism and Christianity. The point is that in ancient Greece, by the time the Christian faith was spreading in the ancient world, a large number of intellectuals and non-intellectuals had already begun to lose faith in the religions of pagan antiquity. The idea that there might be one mind, one God, behind the whole universe that we see had been spearheaded by the ancient Greeks. And many of the highest, most well-educated people were already believing that. They didn't believe in Zeus or Poseidon or Hades or anything like that. Aristotle and Plato and others had begun spreading the idea that back of the physical world we see is one God, one mind. And that agreed very, very tidily with the Jewish and the Christian faith. So that's why in the early history of the church, these two things tend to come together. So what I want to talk a little bit about historically is how those two things come together. But in this lesson, which I've entitled The Voice of Reason, I think a lot of times we don't always appreciate how much man's intellectual pursuit of truth in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, in the modern world, what a huge impact that has had on the Christian faith. And so I begin today with ancient Greece. I'm going to stop, see if there's any questions or comments. Some of this may be familiar to you if you've heard it before. Others of you might not have thought too much about this. So we're starting today with, it's almost like a little bit of a history lesson on what happened in ancient Greece and how that paved the way, so to speak, for many ancient peoples to embrace the Christian faith. Because the Greeks had already begun promoting the idea that there is one God, one mind behind the universe as we know it. This is my chance to teach a mini ancient history class. History of ideas. History of ideas. So on page 15, I have this what's called the Via Antiqua. That means the ancient way. After the appearance of philosophy, it was practiced throughout the Persian Wars, the conquest of Alexander the Great, and the Roman Empire. Even in the book of Acts, when Paul visits Athens, he encounters a significant number of philosophers. Academies were established, schools of thought. Independently minded intellectuals appeared. Varro, Cicero, and Seneca are well known. The average person continued to worship the gods of the traditional pantheon. So most people were still worshiping Zeus and Poseidon and Hades. But an increasing number began to gravitate toward what I here call morally conscientious monotheism, the belief that there's one God and that he demands good behavior. That idea now becoming very, very widespread in the West. Some of them gravitated toward Judaism. They were called God-fearers. We encounter them from time to time in the New Testament. Gentiles who become interested in the Jewish religion and their monotheistic beliefs. We have a number of Jewish philosophers, Philo is the most famous, who begin combining Judaism with Greek ideas. Philo of Alexandria, you can still buy his books, is one of the earliest Jews to try to, he's Jewish, but he's a philosopher at the same time. So he's what today we'd fairly call a theologian. You don't have theologians in the Old Testament. Isaiah's a prophet, Jeremiah's a prophet, but Philo is what you might call a systematic theologian. He's Jewish, but he uses logic and reason to present his Jewish beliefs in a kind of systematic way, and he is one of the earliest. Then Christianity comes on the scene, and of course the earliest Christians are not philosophers at all. They're the poor, they're the marginalized, they're people in difficult circumstances. But as Christianity spreads, I'll talk a little bit about this in the sermon today. Some of the people who become Christians are wealthy. Some of the people who become Christians are politicians. Some of the people who become Christians are intellectuals. And so now you're going to have the first, I think Aristides is probably one of the first professional intellectuals who are also Christians at the same time, and then they want to present their Christian faith in a kind of intellectual way. Probably Paul is the earliest precursor to this. Paul, I think, of all of the writers in the New Testament, I think Paul is one of the greatest minds of the first century. He's just a really, really remarkable individual. But he's not a philosopher. If you read Rome, we went through the book of Romans. It's not a philosophy book. And it's not as though Jesus gathered his 12 disciples around him and turned them into academics. Quite a few of them were fishermen, religious revolutionaries, people of all different types. So it isn't until the 2nd century AD that you begin to get Christians of a sort of intellectual flavor. So in the second paragraph on page 16, I'll talk a little bit about some of these. I mention here Paul's nuanced position regarding the relationship between faith and reason. I'm going to come back to that idea. What is the relationship between faith and reason? In the 2nd century, some people begin attacking Christianity because it's becoming popular, and they're using rational arguments against it. Celsus is a Greek pagan. He says Jesus was not born of a virgin. He says Mary was raped by a Roman soldier. And that's how Jesus came into being, and that's why nobody knows who his father is. He says the miracles didn't happen. They were tricks. In other words, he says those prophecies in the book of Daniel were written after they had already happened. So he's bringing arguments against Christianity. The only reason he's doing that is because Christianity is growing in popularity. Now, a number of early Christians now have to respond to this, and they're called the apologists. So I'll just write that word up here on the board. The voice of reason in the Christian church fairly coincides with the birth of apologetics.
So much for the tree of life.
Yeah, so much for the tree of life. Now it's all apologetics, which is, it's an old Greek word. It means a defense, a rational defense. And that begins in the 2nd century A.D. Anybody in here take a class on apologetics? What did you do in the class? Talk arguments for God's existence, that sort of a thing?
We just studied all about, it was a very narrow-minded class.
Okay.
You would think.
I got to teach one next year at the school, but apologetics is basically a rational defense of Christianity. Somebody says there is no God, you say, yes, there is, and you have an argument about it. Somebody says Jesus didn't rise from the dead. You say, yes, he did, and then you have an argument about it. Somebody says the Bible can't be trusted. The documents have been tampered with. And you say, no, they haven't been tampered with, and you argue about it. And it's not just about argument, but it's about presenting reasons that lie behind the beliefs that we have. And that, of course, begins in the 2nd century. Christianity is growing. It's developing powerful opponents. So I mention here on page 16, Aristides is the first apologist we know of. He's from Athens. He converts to Christianity about 125 A.D. So that's a couple decades after the book of Revelation is written. He's a professional philosopher. He's in Athens. He becomes a Christian. And you can still read his writings. If you find the Apology of Aristides, you can find it on the internet. It's probably about 10 pages. And he delivers it to the emperor of the Roman Empire in defense of Christian belief. So that's our earliest bit of... So he is the precursor to, say, C.S. Lewis. He is the C.S. Lewis of the 2nd century. He attacks pagan religion as ridiculous, and he argues that for a monotheistic natural theology, what does that mean? He argues that if we observe the world and if we reason about it, we will arrive at the conclusion that there's one God, not a whole lot of gods, and that he demands good moral conduct. And it isn't like in Homer's Iliad, it's all just a power game. In the years that followed, the church produced a number of apologists. There's Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen of Alexandria. Those are some of the earliest theologians, and I'll mention Origen is probably the first systematic theologian of the church. He's the first to write a whole treatise on systematic theology. After Christianity is made legal in 312 by Constantine, they try to draw up a systematic statement of faith in the Nicene Creed. And many of the great saints of the church, Athanasius, Gregory, and others, devote themselves to refining that. When you get to the 5th century, you come up against St. Augustine. And by the time you get to St. Augustine, he will be the greatest theologian, both an apologist and dogmatic of the early church. So St. Augustine mastered all of the tradition of the church up to his own time, both arguments for Christianity, that's apologetics, and then the development of Christian doctrine. If I had to name the top 5 most influential Christians in the history of the church, he would be one of them. St. Augustine is one of the top 5. What would the others be? Martin Luther. Martin Luther had an incredible impact. Probably Thomas Aquinas. I would put Origen of Alexandria in the top. And maybe, this is tough, in the 20th century, maybe Karl Barth as one of the most influential theologians. Now, influential doesn't mean right about everything. It just means influential of the church. So what I want to do today is on page 16 and into 17, I talk a little bit more about the history. After the fall of Rome, for the rest of the medieval period, the church was the sole preserver of classical civilization. There's the Greek Orthodox Church in the east, the Roman Catholic Church in the west. Eventually they pull apart. But today I want to talk a little bit about sort of how this journey of reason has developed over the course of the history of the church. But I suppose you have your New Testament documents. If I were to select 3 things in the history, that would be the takeaway. You have your New Testament. In the 2nd century A.D., you have the first apologists using reason to argue for Christianity. By the time you get to St. Augustine, you have a full, developed, systematic theology. But that's a process. If you read Romans, that's not a systematic theology. You can get systematic theology out of it, but it's a letter written to the Roman church where Paul is hitting his big points. So that's the New Testament. By the time you get to the 2nd century AD, you have people presenting philosophical arguments for God's existence, for Jesus' resurrection, for the reliability of the Bible. By the time you get to St. Augustine, if you read his City of God, 2 fat volumes of Christian theology that influenced the church from that time forward. It's a monumental work, and it encompasses all of the learning of everything that went in front of it in a single book. It's an incredible work. I've read through it many times, and it's a great work. That's an example of the voice of reason, how Christians have used their thinking and reasoning ability to combine it with their Christian faith. I'm going to pause a moment and see if there's any question or comment about that. Everybody following what I'm doing up here, or am I flying way over your heads? Am I going too quick? You've heard of St. Augustine. Oh, yeah. And I know you've heard of the Apostle Paul. These 2nd century apologists, probably you haven't heard of Aristides. Anybody heard of Justin Martyr? Justin Martyr, a few of you have. Tertullian is our earliest Latin Christian apologist. And Origen is an early Greek one. Tertullian invented the Latin word trinitas, which we get the word Trinity from. So some of these also coined words that became standard within the church from that time forward. So these are what are sometimes called the church fathers. And the church fathers are the early leaders of the church who are not canonical. You won't find them in the Bible, but they are the ones who led the church after the days of the apostles.
So they're really like a century removed, a generation or 2 or a century removed.
Pretty close, though there's an earlier group of the church fathers called the Apostolic Fathers. that is a transitional group. The apostolic fathers are not the apostles, but they knew the apostles. So
You mentioned Origen, people like that, right?
Origen did not know the
But
apostles.
he studied under, I always get this wrong. He studied under someone who did know John, correct?
Yeah, so if you think of the Apostle John from the New Testament, he had a disciple named Polycarp.
Right.
And Polycarp's one of the famous apostolic fathers. He's not in the Bible, but if you had met Polycarp, he knew John. Clement is mentioned in some of Paul's letters, and we have 2 letters from Clement, one of which is probably authentic. And so Clement wrote a letter called First Clement. You can find it on the internet, and it's valuable. He personally knew Paul. And so he's not an apostle, and he's not just a church father. He's sort of between the two. And probably the next most famous church father is Ignatius of Antioch. Papias is another. But what happens is as you go from our New Testament documents to the time after the New Testament, you have this, I taught a little bit about it in the Christian history class, you have this little in-between group of people. I taught a class years ago called Men Who Knew the Apostles. That's basically what it was, Men Who Knew the Apostles. Which is pretty cool. I mean, if I personally knew Paul, that might add some authority to anything I said in church. Like if I was preaching something, you'd say, where did you get that? And I said, well, it's not in the Bible, but you know, Paul and I were associates. And you're like, wow, okay, you knew who the Apostle Paul was. So I think this is important, particularly for Protestants, because Protestants focus on the Bible, which is fine. A downside of that, though, is a lot of them don't know any history after the New Testament. Once you're done with Peter and Paul, you're done. And so they don't know that there was a guy called Papias or Ignatius or Polycarp. Whereas if you go to a Greek Orthodox or a Catholic church, those are pretty important guys because they're very tradition-focused within those churches. And at the very least, they know who they are. You drive down the street, you'll see a church called St. Ignatius, or St. So-and-so, or St. such-and-such. On page 17, I have a section here called the Via Moderna, and that will be probably where I end today. So I was hoping to get to some actual rational arguments. But while we're talking about the voice of reason, this first lesson is basically a history class on how Christians have used reason in presenting and understanding their faith. So on page 17, I say the scientific revolution has shaped the modern world perhaps more than anything else, did have its origin in the medieval church. I mentioned William of Ockham here, who is a 13th, 14th century monk. He died of the Black Death, but he was one of the first to begin promoting the idea of going to nature and performing experiments to find out truths. There's a famous passage in Aristotle's Physics where I like Aristotle, and he wrote our earliest systematic treatise on physics, where Aristotle says if you drop a lighter object and if you drop a heavier object, the heavier object will fall faster. And, of course, that's false because they fall at the same rate because there's a gravitational pull. I guess the lesson there is Aristotle was what we call an armchair thinker. He sat in his chair and he thought and he reasoned and he drew conclusions. But all he would need to do to know that that statement is false is to do what? Perform a experiment. Just take a bowling ball, take a marble, drop them from a roof, and just watch. If he had done that, he would have seen, well, golly, I would have thought the heavier object would have gone faster. But golly gee whiz, it doesn't. And so William of Ockham is one of the first to say, we should just go out there and perform some experiments. And what we will see might surprise us. And of course, he's absolutely right about that. He's a Franciscan monk, and he does teach that reason can go no farther than the natural sciences. He begins to promote the idea that it's okay to sit in your chair and think about things, but you need to go out and perform some experiments, find some things out. After the Black Death had decimated the population of Europe, the reconstruction of cultural life that followed came to accept the division between reason and faith. One of the things Occam says is that there are things that we can prove through reason, and there are things that we can't. And the things that we can't belong to the realm of faith. The things that we can prove, that belongs to the realm of reason. And that becomes really big after his time. So I talk a little bit about the Renaissance here, and boy, this is just name dropping toward the bottom of page 17.
Is this the Occam's razor?
That's right. Occam's razor. How many have heard of Occam's razor? And a lot of people don't know what it is, but basically Occam got frustrated because he felt like there's these elaborate explanations for things. And Occam's razor says, if you can explain the phenomenon through a simple explanation or a complicated one, the simple one is probably the correct one. And it became important actually in overturning a number of medieval theories. If there's a phenomenon, you can have a number of different explanations for it. But some of them may be very, very complicated, and some of them may be very, very simple. And Occam's razor simply says, cut off the excess fat. The simple explanation is probably the correct one. And in many cases, that seems to be true. Occam's razor. Page 18, I talk a little bit about the ongoing journey of reason. How much time do I have? 10 minutes?
Yeah, a lot of time.
I got a lot of time here. The Protestant Reformation has a huge impact. The movement tries to restore the doctrine of salvation by grace through faith to its rightful place at the center, and also to remedy various abuses which had crept into the church. Sale of indulgences, a lot of superstitious beliefs about the Mass, and papal authority had gotten way out of control. Scholastic theologians were trying to defend the church's teaching up to that point. There's quite a few humanist theologians like Erasmus and Thomas More who are trying to reform the church from within, but the big hitters at the day, heavy hitters, are Martin Luther and Zwingli in Germany and in Switzerland. Now, Zwingli will be outpaced by Calvin in the Swiss Reformation, but he's contemporary with Martin Luther. Protestants' main concern is to remain faithful to the Scriptures. And so they were very kind of ambiguous about the role of reason in religious faith. And that I've seen continues up to the present day. There are more, for many centuries, more Roman Catholic philosophers than there were Protestant philosophers. Protestants were more concerned with follow the Bible. Martin Luther was no friend of philosophy. He was very, very suspicious of it. And so Protestantism has kind of a complicated history here. I find in many American Protestant churches almost hostility to the exercise of reason. And that begins with the earliest reformers. However, huge religious and political conflicts that followed rendered the question of whether personal faith could be rationally discussed a matter of great practical urgency. In the Roman Church, the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, and we have a number of very important theologians, Molina and Suarez, who use reason to defend the Roman Catholic position. In Protestantism, Richard Hooker in England and then Jacob Arminius also begin reasoning their way through Protestant doctrines in ways that Luther and Calvin did not. And so they are kind of precursors to the Enlightenment in Europe and America in the 17th and the 18th centuries. In Europe, the separation of church and state proved a rather bloody proceeding because it could only advance by dissolving those nations in which religious and secular life had been conjoined. In America, separation of church and state was a more peaceful proceeding. And this is due to the fact of its being planted on virgin soil. There were no governments to dismantle in America, just a lot of Native Americans to uproot and move along. In Europe, however, the cultural life of the West was much different. And we have the development of philosophy and science and the humanities now outside the church. So Francis Bacon being the earliest, nominally a man of faith, but he believed that the proper employment of reason lay in the empirical method, the acquisition of scientific knowledge, and the use of technology to advance the race's practical interests. The printing press, gunpowder, and the magnet. Big inventions of the day. And then the philosophical community kind of becomes divided at that point. In this class today, I've kind of gone through the ancient, medieval, and the modern development of reason. But in the modern era, a lot of Christians have begun to go back to the idea that reason is an important part of our spiritual development. How can Christians combine the use of their reason and their scientific knowledge with their Christian faith? We see that developing early in the 2nd century in the theology of Augustine in the ancient church, Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and then in the modern period among Protestants. What I'm going to probably do next week. Next week I'm going to be out of town because I'm going on vacation with my family. I want to present a few arguments, one from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and the other is the cosmological argument that you find in Thomas Aquinas. And then just sort of talk through them as ways in which Christians in academia use reason to argue for God's existence. A lot of times that's not the sort of thing that happens in church. And you don't want to turn a church into kind of a college class or an academy, but on the other hand, I have my role here at the church at New Temple, and then I teach at the school, and then I went to the university. There's a big gap between what goes on in the churches and what goes on in the academic world when it comes to religion. Big, big gap. And I don't know that we can fix that here, but what I do think is that Christians need to know that outside what we do in church from week to week, singing and liturgy and Bible study, there are a significant number of Christians who are professional. They're professors, they're teachers, they work in the academy, they fight for Christian ideas on an academic level. And a lot of times people in churches don't even know that these people exist. And they've given their lives to it. And the way Christian theologians work, I guess what I would say is this. We do need to know about it in church because what happens in the academy is going to come down in the church in just a matter of decades anyways. It trickles down. You know how in economics they talk about trickle down? If we make sure that the wealthy people have a lot of money, then the people at the bottom will benefit. Now, some people don't think that that's true, and some people do think that it's true, but you know what trickle down is. That happens in academics too. When I was teaching the Romans class, do you remember me talking about the new perspective on Paul?
Yes.
That, maybe you didn't like that.
Distinctly, I remember that.
That's trickle down. That idea came out in 1977. That's the year I was born. And it happened at the highest levels of academia. Now, if you go online and engage in a religious discussion about Paul or Romans, whether you agree with that idea or not, you're going to have to come to grips with it because it's trickled down. It's now been about 50 years that idea is working its way into the teaching of a lot of different churches. Some people are happy with it, some are unhappy with it, some are ambivalent about it. Plus and minus both. But the point is that in the voice of reason, Christians have always used reason at high academic levels to think about theological ideas. It takes decades, sometimes a half a century. But eventually, those ideas find their way into the ordinary church. And so, you just have to know about them. You just have to know that they're coming. Let me stop and see if there's any questions or comments. Today's lesson's very detail heavy, a lot of history, maybe a little bit dry. But then next time I come to you, I'll probably erase some of this stuff on the board and we'll actually do some reasoning. It's like I'll do some arguments for God's existence. It'd be odd, to go to church for 20 years. I went to church for 20 years as a kid and I never heard a single argument for God's existence until I went to college. And that seemed odd to me. So, now I don't present it because I think that you're all somehow secretly doubting whether there's a God. If you did, you wouldn't be here at church. Or in most cases, people don't believe in God because their reason or their head told them to. People have other reasons for believing in God. But it is our rational thinking is a part of all that we are as people. And this is the sort of thing that goes on in academies and in any of philosophy of religion class. So you have to get at least a little bit of a taste of it. And there it is. Yeah.
Do you know what the subject matter is next week for Sunday school?
Brandon hasn't told me. But he's here today.
I'm a little afraid of him, so I'll just wait.
Oh, it's